Music is mathematics. It actually helps the analytical side of your brain. I've always called it emotional mathematics because you're trying.
Gregg Rolie, who cleared the way making room for two of the best rock bands historically, but whose name is seldom that he was the voice that was initially mentioned. The person behind Black Magic Woman who delivered the initial melodies of Evil Ways and Oe Kovar, talented keyboardist that added Latin rock elements to the Santana mythology, and subsequently paved the basis for Journey, where he additionally performed as the primary vocalist. However, when they mention Santana, Carlos comes to mind. They call out Steve when they bring up Journey. Gregg Rolie and Perry were present. Silently, unassumingly, but irreplaceably for nearly half a century, Gregg Rolie never sought attention. He quietly left the spotlight. Went back as quietly as before and carried on to motivate with each note he played. No gimmicks, controversies, or shocking focuses, solely on music, and completely committed to it. Twice admitted to an accolade is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Only available to a select few, Rolie never donned a Legends label. He just lived an honest life as a musician. Subtle and unwavering, this is Gregg's story. Rolie, a man who didn't require the spotlight to view, a performer who left the shadows behind but moved out of them. A mark that will always remain throughout history. Gregg Allen Rowley's early life began on June 17, 1947, Seattle, Washington, rain-prone city where the peace and calm contemplative afternoons seemed to shape his reflective disposition from an early age. But shortly after, his relatives moved to the acreage in Palo Alto, California. Of blooming, sunshine, and good schools, American dreams in the post-war era, Gregg was raised in a middle-class household. Either his parents weren't wealthy or impoverished artists, yet they consistently supported their Gregg and his son listened to themselves. Precisely that, while other children were occupied engaging in baseball or becoming fixated about hot, he sat on wheels in front of an antique piano. Learning chords one by one with patience, he wasn't struck by music like lightning. It arrived as a steady stream of didn't study or attend a conservatorium under any notable teacher. He learned by listening to Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry, and Ray Charles's subsequent records were all classroom. Each individual has the opportunity to grow his inner world's boundaries. At Cubley, Gregg was a quiet student in high school who enjoyed technical illustration, and once thought about pursuing architectural studies. But he sneaked out at night to practice with his William Penn, the original garage band, and what really made his heart racing were his friends. Teenage revolt wasn't the only thing that was a wake-up call. He couldn't ignore him. He didn't have a difficult upbringing. No old people or family tragedy occurred. Wounded to include into his music, but maybe that very serenity turned into ideal conditions for the introspective type of music he would eventually compose, the kind that doesn't require yelling need to flaunt but is sufficiently deep to. Gregg Rolie failed to provide a soul-stirring, adversity-filled upbringing into music. He brought about an early understanding that genuine art, being great, doesn't need being loud. Early years in the late 1960s, in the midst of escalating anti-war demonstrations, hallucinogenic sensations, and a desire for culture, California's wave of freedom. When Gregg Rolie was young, he met Carlos Santana, a Mexican guitarist with seemingly to look into a spiritual world. The two couldn't have been more. Gregg was different. He was a structured man. And reasoning, which he liked tight arrangements with distinct melodies and succinct. Contrarily, Carlos performed the lyrics as though he were attempting to touch his guitar solos may linger throughout the universe for 10 minutes, looping in a near state of meditation. But maybe it was precisely this contrast that produced something genuinely unique that combines Latin rock, blues, and gritty psychedelia but contemplative. They established the later Santana Blues Band was abbreviated to. Over the ensuing years, Santana performed at outdoor festivals and pubs. However, It happened at Woodstock, and when hundreds of thousands came together in 1969 on an upstate New York field covered with mud. Santana's explosive arrival on the scene, and in that time as the Latin percussion Gregg wailed and the guitar thundered. From his Hammond, Rolie's voice emerged. Rolie, a new legend, was born. Didn't require extravagant attire because he wasn't frontman of the band, yet his voice was heavy, strong, and harsh, turned into the sonic characteristics of songs such as Evil Ways, O Co Va, and Black Magic Woman. In a band rich in a variety of cultures, he was the quiet leader guiding the gathering. His performance grounded what Santana ran the danger of failing in its spiritual and philosophical pursuits. The Abraxas album from 1970 signified an undeniable peak, yet as the spotlight grew stronger, so did the Carlos Santana's fractures started to turn. Internalized by the guru Sri Chinmoy, he began to weave spiritual lessons, free-form jazz and meditation into the band's sound. Rolie grew concerned that the audience and the music were becoming less focused, was being abandoned. Tensions increased. Carlos wanted to jam in the studio, play freely and without restrictions as desired, structure songs that start with a middle and an end. Their debates dragged late at night. Occasionally they ceased speaking. "We were still making singing together," Rolie subsequently recalled. "But we weren't paying attention to one another. No more." Things became so tense that several participants started phoning their spiritual fights continue at their shows. Carlos thought of the band stage as a vehicle for a position involving a transcendent journey, merely desired for the music to speak truthfully to people's hearts. In 1972, after 3 Gregg Rolie's albums and hundreds of performances left Santana without holding a press conference. Spectacular farewell. He departed in the manner that he arrived, subtly but firmly. He was unable to longer remain in an area without music. He left because it no longer felt like home. Not a loss, but rather a moment of honesty and the start of a new and similarly amazing chapter on a journey where Gregg Rolie would be named Journey emerge once more and create a fresh voice. For Rock in the Journey II was founded in the 1970s. Chapter following Santana's departure, and Gregg Rolie didn't get lost in 1972, but he also didn't jump into anything. Leaving from a band at its peak with declining fame, wealth, and innumerable chances, but Rolie never had any. He needed time to pursue the spotlight, pay attention to himself, and determine if being a musician was still your calling or merely a recollection. From that silent time he maintained communication with Neil Schon, the young guitarist who had performed with both men had been swept by him in Santana. Up in Carlos Santana's steadily growing spiritual insight, and they both believed it was its time to make something new. Band without feeling obligated to be revolutionary in terms of philosophy. Only in 1973, they performed music out of instinct. Established journey with the goal of pushing rock to the intersection of technical proficiency and feeling. In the band's early years centered on progressive rock that was combined with complex experimental jazz fusion music. Gregg Rolie assumed 2 responsibilities as the main singer and keyboardist, bringing the renowned Hammond B3 to the heart of the group's sound. Journalists published their first album in a purely progressive rock effort from 1975, where the instrumentals Rolie was the sonic core that dominated the principal keyboardist, whose profound lead, and the Hammond-toned swirling singer with a dry, powerful, blues rock voice. The Journey album wasn't a particularly good one, and despite being a commercial hit, it was a musical band's manifesto that wouldn't reach a compromise and consider the future. 1976 and later 1977 carried on the band's musical investigations, but indications of unbalance appeared. Their music was regarded as intellectual for general audiences, and Columbia Records progressively pushed the band should locate a more approachable lead. Gregg Rolie's defining vocalist, early Santana's and Jury's voices. It was a subtle yet painful blow as business constraints increased. In 1977, after a series of stressful internal meets, a young tenor named Steve Perry, known as the Rock's Sam Cooke, it was brought Perry was welcomed by Gregg Rolie into Journey. With clarity rather than bitterness, he saw Perry's business potential, but realized that this was the conclusion of his function as Jury's main voice. The album Infinity, 1978, was a Steve Perry was now the vocalist for the new age center, and Rolie took a step back, concentrating on the backup voices and keyboards, but without a doubt, Gregg was the one who Perry was mentored in those early days. Assisting him in comprehending the band's language keeps its underlying rhythm and stop quiet tensions from becoming into actual divisions. Maybe just Gregg could have carried out the action as the creator who understood when to back off. Infinity was an enormous triumph that produced hits like Wheel in the Sky and Light's follow-up Departure, 1980, and Evolution, 1979. Enabled Journey to rise through the ranks of America's top arena rock bands, but Rolie's energy was waning. Exhausting studio scheduling for tours demands and an increasing detachment from the basic musical spirit of the band remained. He was performing out of commitment in 1980 following the completion of Departing. Gregg Rolie decided there was no controversy upon leaving Jury. Grievances. He even proposed his own substitute keyboardist Jonathan Kaw from Rolie, the Babies, personally handed over the Hammond B3. As if in a silent ceremony, nobody forced him to follow the musical succession. Out, he decided to resign like the conductor exiting the stage following once finishing his own symphony. Rolie declared, "Jury's accomplishment makes me proud, yet I wasn't really a part of it anymore, and I didn't want to compromise my morals in order to continue." He went back to his house, where his Lori, their spouse, and their 2 small children were waiting for almost 20 years. After then, he didn't have platinum LPs that don't have sold-out tours yet have things that no stage could ever provide: Tranquility, Truth, Family, The Years of Silence, and the After Departing Journey in 1980, Return after disappearing from the rock, Gregg Rolie TV, no new singles, and no spotlight appearances that don't make the news. Public interviews. It might have appeared to be finished, but in reality it was only the start of a new phase. One set aside for unnecessary items, he went back home to be noisy and did something that he had not really done in almost 20 years: became a parent, a spouse, and merely led a typical life in a house. He took his children close to Austin, Texas, in the evenings, the school performed music and read books quietly without any staging. No crowd pressure, but music never. Rolie left him in 1991 and made a silent return without the glaring lights. But between former and current friends, Journey members Ross Valerie and Steve Smith founded a group known as The Storm. No blockbuster was anticipated. Just seasoned musicians getting back in touch with the delight of playing with passion rather than very high on the charts. The single I Learned a Lot About Love, and ascended to number 6 on the mainstream Billboard chart. The Storm's rock chart achieved a quiet achievement, but it was sufficient to demonstrate one, considering that Rolie was still present when he decided that he was still capable of producing something. Things caused people to pause and pay attention. But Eye of the Storm was the band's second album. Was placed on indefinite hold by Interscope. The market had changed to grunge records. Had taken control, and Rolie and other artists felt out of place in a generation that no longer thought that Hammond-driven, unfazed by love songs. Rolie went back to his origins in 1998. He got back together with previous bandmates of Santana, such as Jose Arias and Michael Shri, will create a Braces Pool as a community immersed in the Latin rock's essence. In their first album was both a tribute to the past and a declaration of those who were previously magicians could still create music at Woodstock that moved the spirit beyond age of 50. A Brax Pool was short-lived, but it provided Rolie with a priceless feeling of peace with the Santana era, a time frame he previously abandoned with Inside Battle. For the first time in about 30, Rolie sang the classic tunes with no more stress. No more old pals conflicts between artists, only involve music and mutual honor. A solo career following years as a lead vocalist and co-founder of the frontman for two iconic groups Gregg Rolie started his trek alone within an other way of thinking, not to produce hits, not to gain notoriety, but to he expresses himself freely and genuinely, as well as without having to please anyone. He made his debut in 1985. Gregg Rolie's solo album was regarded as, after decades, a personal musical manifesto spent in cooperative environments. The album geared into AOR album-oriented rock and vintage rock, combining his distinctive keyboard textures of ham enriched the song I Want Is One with mellow guitar lines. To Return did not chart well at the period but would go on to become popular. For Eddie Money is a silent tribute to Rolie's persistent and undervalued 2 years later, songwriting skill emerged. His second album Gringo, in contrast to Gringo's debut, 1987, was a bolder declaration. Latin rock had a comeback and components integrated into the foreground of jazz, rock and funk and international music. Rolie's returned to his Santana origins from his own distinct viewpoint. However, Gringo was appreciated but not given much publicity by critics as Rolie's most character-rich album, presenting a fusion of current and historical methods and emotion, Latin percussion and classic keyboards after a prolonged period of concentration on family and the occasional show. Rolie, with The Storm and Arise Pool, resurfaced in 2001 with the name's origins, stated that everything was a return to his musical. The album's beginnings were filled with blues. Rolie's influences include soul and jam bands. Assuming duties as a keyboardist and vocalist and producer, the record wasn't created for widespread recognition, but for leading an honest life through raw, impromptu music and disinterested in radio play beginnings. They turned into favored by loyal followers, providing a close-up view of an artist tired of the sector yet remained enamored with the essence of music. Wasn't discovered until 2019. Almost 20 years after Gregg Rolie released Sonic, another album. Ranch was captured at the famous Texas. The record is produced by the same-named studio. The sum of all that defines Rolie's voice: subtle Latin undertones, deep roots in classic rock storytelling via keyboard, and a voice no longer youthfully ferocious but aged and more authentic tunes than before, such as What Feelings of Love and Don't Be Cruel, statements made by a man who formerly stood in the limelight and now discovers friendship in music itself, but no longer praised by the press, similar to his Journey or Santana days. Gregg Rolie's solo career represents a comeback to essence. No lavish studios, no pushy producers, just use his well-known Hammond. Stories stated in chords and B3 are not to be lauded, but just to be acknowledged by his private life in a society where rock musicians are frequently connected to nasty divorces, flaming romances, or ongoing controversy. Gregg Rolie is known for an anomaly, not because he didn't live in the public eye, but because he consistently understood when to leave it and when to continue to have a space where he could just plain. His marriage to Lori Rolie took place in the late 1970s, similar to his jury career was taking off when they first met. While Rolie worked as a flight attendant, Lori for a traveling performer, it wasn't a hectic Hollywood romance. Instead of a stable relationship based on comprehension and respecting one another, they made a unique decision in the touring musician industry to put after leaving Journey, family comes before celebrity. Rolie decided a few things in 1980. At the time, musicians dared to make became a father full-time, he once stated. I didn't want to be just the man that people knew via music publications, but an unknown to his own children. He and Lori children, a daughter and a son, during the 1980s and the first part of the 1990s, but his former commercial success was achieved by Journey bandmates. With songs like Faithfully and Open Arms, Rolie was converting a carport in her house into a music room, training his kids to play Driving to Parents, and using instruments talks with teachers, and when his wife Lori authored the Memes children's book series. Their family served as the inspiration for Little World. Rolie wrote the music for the background of the audiobooks in the manner that he secretly made a behind-the-scenes contribution, never aiming for the highest billing, reflects the manner in which he has spent his whole life, not merely wanting to be seen in order to a component of something significant. The Rolie family resides close to Austin, Texas, where he has his own studio, a modest garden, and a leisurely pace of living that allows still hear a Hammond organ echoing on a calm afternoon. Despite having led thunderous Madison Square Garden performances today, casual jam brings him joy. Meetings with pals, times when he the grandchild inquires, "Were you actually famous?" And slower moving sunsets. He has never been featured in tabloids. Never needed to apologize in public for individual errors, possibly due to Gregg Rolie has always been reticent. Not because he was unable to make noise, but because he didn't think it was necessary. Gregg Rolie's legacy and impact were not the type of name that adorn magazine covers frequently. He didn't spearhead a revolution in culture, led a march without dragging rocks into spiritual theology or politics, but he did something that very few people can do. Musicians throughout music's history has he contributed to creating the distinctive sound? At the birth of two, not just one, Santana's iconic ensembles, he was the original lead singer, the driving force of Oi Kova and Black Magic Woman Evil Ways. He was more than just a singer. He was the center of the hands on the early tracks. Latin rock was introduced by Hammond B3 for the first time to major American stages, from Woodstock to Fillmore West, while Carlos Santana considered meditation as a way to Rolie maintain the melody in the cosmos. Grounded, using blues rock as an anchor. Roots that allowed it to be reached even by people who have never heard a conga drum before. Prior to Journey, he started in a completely other chapter of American progressive rock, technically strong, and constructed for the band's first stadiums despite not being commercial hits. 3 albums at the time set the framework for what would grow to be among rock's most successful performers. As well as when Steve Perry, Gregg Rolie entered the spotlight. Gently stepped back, manning the harmony, singing keyboards, and preserving internal balance across a few artists have delicate power shifts. Whoever used to be a bandleader could do those. Two sonic blueprints were established by bands. When he no longer felt he could, he left twice. Belonged, and Gregg Rolie is credited with being inducted twice into the Rock, and 1998 saw Santana inducted into the Roll Hall of Fame. And once more with Journey in 2017, a rare honor, but one that a man deserves. Who put self-discipline aside to be silent. Well done. His influence doesn't originate from declarations of grandeur. What he left behind were the sounds of the blazing Black Magic Woman, is opened by Hammond B3. A voice as thick as smoke from cigarettes, but full of the sturdy, unwavering sensation keyboard underpinnings of more dazzling stars, is the impact of a person who didn't have to take center stage to be a rock. Wasn't rewritten by pillar Gregg Rolie.